understanding other cultures, or well, and in part, just really kind of understanding what's going on in one's own ancestral thought process a lot of the times, or not ancestral thought process, but ancestry. What it is that you can find when you're going back there, and how to find it and what to look for, things like that. And also the understanding of, where many of us are really coming from, right? Um, when I am coming into TikTok, to try and do the things that I try and do in TikTok, I'm specifically coming in here for a couple of reasons. One is that while I love writing, and while I am trying to write a book, a novel, and while I have written and published other books, and while I have many things that I'm working on, I am well aware that today's human needs a grasp, needs to be drawn in. I really believe clickbait works. Like, I think clickbait is a positive thing. You just have to give some meat behind the clickbait, right? Use that clickbait to draw people in, and then give some meat behind that clickbait. And so I really find that to be a very positive thing to do. And in that awareness, I understand that, a book, especially the kind of book that I would write, when it comes to writing a big book about history or about the grave that I'm working on, or things like that, is heavy, and it's weighty, and it's a lot of pages, and it's a lot of things to understand and to dig into. And when we're trying to do that, it's very difficult for many people to really maintain the attention span sometimes for something like that. Or I used to, a lot better, but now I can't maintain a lot of attention span myself, right? Just because of mental health issues or other things. And when we live in a world where there's not a lot of attention span anyways, it makes that much harder, right? So I believe in the power of clickbait. And that's one of the reasons that I am here within TikTok, is because, well, I'm putting all of these things into book form, and I'm doing all of that stuff to get people to actually truly understand on a broad scale, to get more than just 10 people to hear. You need to do it in a different way. And so I am trying to use the modern technology that we have, this amazing things that, starts with Homo erectus's discovery of how to control fire and ends with a phone. Well, I am, or I'm trying to utilize those modern technology things that we have to try and get information out on a broader scale. And one of the things of information that I'm trying to get out on a broader scale is what I was asked to do. I have many family members in many different communities, and I've been asked a couple times to help people of European descent find their own history instead of appropriating other people's cultural history. And that was one thing that I was asked to do. And it's one thing that I utilize my degrees for, is as helping my siblings of European descent understand not to take from my siblings of non-European descent, and to find their own history. Because as we're trying to be ancestral worshipers, as we're trying to find our history, as we're trying to do those things, it's very difficult for many of us. And so to be able to do that, this is something to do. What's the falsehood about Neanderthals? I will do my best. And so that's one of the things that I come in here and do. I work mainly on a focus of paleoanthropology, because of the fact that when I am looking at paleoanthropology, I can see very innate things about us. And I want other people to see those beautiful innate things about us, because I know that most of us actually think of ourselves as locusts. Most of us actually think of ourselves as the problem on this planet. And having spent half of my life thinking I was the problem, I want to make sure that other people don't think that they're the problem, right? And so I want people to understand just how innately compassionate and nurturing and communal and creative we are as a species. Because if I can get people to understand just how compassionate and nurturing and creative that we are as a species biologically, like innately as a part of us, and maybe I can get people to understand that we're not this evil that we need to fight, right? If I can get people back into that space and back into that mind frame and back into that understanding, then maybe I can, kind of pull some of this out, right? Now, of course, just because we're innately something doesn't mean we haven't been indoctrinated into being something else, correct? So, when I am teaching paleoanthropology, when we're talking about paleoanthropology, it is to try and give people those understandings. One of the things, though, that I was asked to do, one of the things that I was told by my family members and told by my different communities that needed to be done was to show people their European history, to show people how to connect to their European history. And so that's what we're going to do today. We don't do that so much usually on here, but I wanted to try to today because of some other conversations that I was having. I am still out of breath. I'm still recovering from COVID. And so I am still having some problems. So if I'm short or if I don't do this very long, that's why. Just wanted to let everybody know. And you can see the widdaord.com website. I did put some information about Gravitians on that website so that you can find it. It's under bibliographies, under ancestors. So this is a Gravitian human being, and so we're going to go ahead and talk about some early European cultures currently, or today. Let me answer this one. He was talking about thumping the women over the head, caveman style trope. It is definitely not something the Neanderthals would have done. I think when we understand that prior to 10,000 years ago, violence wasn't a part of of humanity. That the evidence that we have of violence prior to 10,000 years ago is so minute and so small, and none of it is definitive evidence. Meaning, yes, it's absolutely this. It's all could be this, or the only thing it could be is this. When we look at that, we really reach that understanding that the tropes of oh, I capture woman, take her home, make her mine, is really out there. When we look at Neanderthal specifically, we can see that Neanderthal specifically, actually, the women are the larger. Like when we talk about sexual diaphragmism, we talk about one sex, biological sex, being on average, which does not mean even most, it just means on average, larger than the other biological sex. And when we look at, one of the other biological sexes, because we have 3 biological sexes. When we look at Neanderthals, we see that the women, the females of the Neanderthals, are actually on average bigger than the males of the Neanderthals. So I don't think the Neanderthal males were going around thumping them on the head anyways, because I think the women were doing the thumping. But I don't think that anybody was really being violent with each other anyways. There's no evidence of that. So if you're new here, if you just listen for a second, we'll go over it all. Cavemen didn't have a lot of violence, and there is not evidence of that. And I actually have articles on my website underneath the bibliography section where it talks about this. The archaeological record shows that in the 2,000 skeletons that we have prior to 10,000 years ago, roughly 2% of them show evidence of something that could be violence. Not that is violence, but that could be violence. And when we look at 10,000 years ago towards now, like after, coming closer to us, we see that the evidence of violence becomes definitive and the evidence of violence rises to 18 to 20%. So we actually don't have any evidence of violence within Neanderthals, and we actually don't have any evidence of violence within us prior to, no definitive evidence at all prior to 10,000 years ago. We have things that could be violence or they could be something else. Like if somebody comes and hits somebody over the head with a rock, I don't necessarily know that they've been hit over the head with a rock by another human being, or that a cave wall fell and hit them in the head with a rock, right? So nothing that's definitive violence. We do see that there is one space where Neanderthals, there's actually one cave that's evidence of cannibalism within Neanderthals for juveniles. Like, well, and I think that there's actually an adult in the bones that have tool marks on them. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is an act of violence. So when we look at the fact of eating our dead, there are religious reasons for eating your dead throughout history. There are also nutritional reasons for eating your dead. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you killed them. So the Donner Party didn't really kill people. They just ate their dead because they were starving, right? So when we look at things like that, that doesn't indicate violence. What it indicates is surviving, right? And it doesn't mean that somebody went and killed this individual and then ate them. What it means is that there was a dead individual. Now, whether or not they ate that dead individual because by eating them, they imbued their spirit in their body, in the person who's eating body, the dieting human being's body, and imbuing that spirit in their body carried on their spirit, or whether or not they ate them to sustain themselves because they were starving, we don't know. So it doesn't mean that there was violence involved. It just means that somebody ate somebody else, right? And when we look at things like, there's the other one that they recently come out with that shows cannibalism about 2 million years ago. The problem is that we have a site that has 3 different species of humans living within it at this point of time. It doesn't necessarily mean that this species was eating their same species, right? So if I go and kill a great ape and eat a great ape, is that cannibalism? If Homo erectus goes and kills a Paranthropus boisei and eats them, is that cannibalism? If there's a dead Paranthropus boisei and I eat it to survive, is that cannibalism? I'm not Paranthropus boisei, right? So that's not necessarily cannibalism even. And it absolutely doesn't show a violence between species. I'm not talking about current, I'm talking about paleoanthropology because we were talking prior to 10,000 years ago. So survival doesn't require violence. I don't, to me, it is not a violent act to hunt and kill a deer. As long as it's a clean kill, I thank that animal for what it's doing by providing for me and my family. And I utilize all of it. That's not violence, that's surviving. Now, if I were to hunt down a deer and shoot it in its leg, and then shoot it in its leg, and then shoot it in its leg, just so that I could like have the thrill of tracking this injured animal across the planet, that's violence. So we have to understand that violence is an act of intentional harm against another being that is not for survivability or self-defense. If somebody is beating the shit out of me and I punch them back, am I being violent or am I defending myself? Right? It is not violence to hunt for survival. It is not violence to eat something that's already dead. It's not violent to protect oneself, right? If a cave lion, or not cave lion, cave bear is attacking me and I kill it in the attack, am I being violent? Is the animal being violent? The animal is trying to eat, right? Violence is an act of intentional harm to another being without the need to defend oneself or the need to survive, right? There's a difference. No, inflicting harm is not inherently violence, right? So like if I say something that is harmful to you that I have no intent of harming you with, I am not being violent to you. Yet if I say something with intent to harm you, I'm being violent towards you, right? So you can inflict harm without being violent. Absolutely 100%. You're trying to get semantic with me, but then you want me to not be semantic back, just stating, right? Anyway, so I today am going to talk about the culture within Southwest Europe, along the top of the Mediterranean, up into the middle of Western Europe, Western Eurasia, um, down into the Iberian Peninsula, roughly 35,000 years ago to about 18,000 years ago. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about a people we call the Gravitians, and the Gravitians are in two different spaces within this space. They kind of spread across the bottom of it, but they have two major cultural centers. And within these two major cultural centers, you're seeing that there are a couple of differences, and there's genetic difference, but there is a broad cultural similarity. And so today we're going to talk about that culture. When we see things like the statue of the Venus of Willendorf, most of the Venus statues that we have, these all come from the Gravatians. So actually the headdress that we see on this individual behind me is, I don't want to delete that. Where can I put it so I don't delete it? Okay. The headdress that you see on this individual behind me is taken from the Venus of Willendorf statue. And there's a couple of different things that you can see within the possibilities of why this headdress is coming into play. There's also a lot of conversation as to whether or not this is like a cap that somebody wears, or if it's actually being braided into somebody's hair and is a part of somebody's hairstyle. There's also a few other things that we see with the Gravatian culture that are pretty unique and pretty distinct. We see that the Gravatian culture is the first to create tools for engraving, though Homo naledi changed that up this last year. When you're looking at the documentary Unknown Cave of Bones, we see that there is a engraving tool in there for carving into the walls of caves, right? Up until, or in Homo sapiens and in all other species other than Homo naledi, we see that the first engraving tools are made within the Gravatian culture. And when we see when we look at the Gravatian culture, what we're looking at is a culture that really spreads really from, let me see if I can pull up the map that I had earlier. Really, that spreads from roughly where the Caucasus Mountains are, not down lower, but that longitude, right? Longitude is this way. That longitude along the planet above roughly where Constantinople would have been, or is. They changed the name though. Anyways, roughly that area of Western Eurasia. So pretty much the start of what we call Western Eurasia over. And you see that this culture spreads pretty much all across any areas of Eurasia that are out from underneath the ice at this period of time. Now, what we're looking at is a culture that moves in during the time when the last glacial maximum has receded enough to start allowing peoples to move across the lower part of Western Eurasia. So I said in Homo sapiens, maybe. So with the Gravatians, what we're looking at is not quite the first culture that we see moving across, but one of the earliest cultures that we see moving across. The I can't pronounce this to save my life. Our Gratian culture is a tool-making culture that is oftentimes associated with the Gravatians or predating the Gravatians. So there's always a couple different views when you look at archaeology, paleoanthropology, anthropology, things like this. There's always a couple of different views of what is going on. And this is because everybody's going to have a different take on something, and some people have different knowledges, right? So there are a couple of different views of what is going on. One of the views is that the Gratian culture and the Gravatian culture are pretty much the same culture. And one of the views is that the Gravatian culture comes after the Gratian culture. So when we're looking at Western Eurasia, what we're looking at is people moving in after 50,000 years ago. Our newest shows that there are a couple of places where Homo sapiens are at 52,000 years ago with Neanderthals in France. For the most part, though, what we're seeing, Oh no, it wasn't in France, it's in Spain. For the most part, though, what we're seeing is that people are moving across roughly 50,000 years ago. Now, when people talk about Homo sapiens leaving the Levant area, or what we typically talk about as coming out of Africa, what we're looking at is, first of all, a time where the ice has pretty much covered most of the globe. The ice age is going really strong, roughly 50,000 years ago. And during this time period, what we're looking at is the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula. These areas are actually a part of the African continent at this time. There is no sea in between them. There aren't these big marshes in between them because of the fact that when the ice gobbles up all the water on the planet, sea levels lower. So we're looking at a period of time up until roughly 50,000 years ago where this is all part of one continent. So when we talk about the fact that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Levant area at 150,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago together, we're talking about a period of time where this is actually a part of Africa at this time. It is part of the same continent. It's not like you have to cross any water or get anywhere to get there. Not that you do anyways, because the Red Sea is like not really the sea half the time. So when we're looking at people moving out of this area, what we're looking at is a time period where the ice is starting to recede. So the Neanderthals are moving back into their homelands, back into the spaces that they've been living and back into the spaces that they developed. And as they're doing that, they're taking different family members with them. During this time when Neanderthal and Homo sapien lived together in the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula for 100,000 years, we live in some spaces, 2 caves, a 5-minute walk from each other. We live together. We are giving each other's culture. We're learning from each other. We're exchanging genetics with each other. This is the vast majority of our influx of Neanderthal DNA within us. And we do see Neanderthal DNA in everybody across the planet pre-colonization, except for 2 spaces within Africa that have ghost species within them instead. And those 2 spaces are the Yoruba population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. So when we're looking at this movement out at the end of the last ice age, we're seeing that as the ice is receding, people are first starting to go east. And the reason that people are first starting to go east is look at the map. As the ice is receding, it's up in mountains first that are kind of blocking you from going west. And so it starts receding and you start being able to go west. Now, we are already able to cross water at this point in time. Neanderthal could cross water. Homo erectus could cross water. We've been crossing water for millions of years at this point. That's awesome. When we're looking at that and we're looking at people moving over, there are certain groups, like I was saying, there's evidence now at 52,000 years ago in France. When we're looking at that, this is water crossings or up along the coastline underneath the glacial retreation. When we're looking at that, we are looking at, again, the fact that we know that Homo erectus crossed water to get to the island of Flores of Indonesia, to get to the island of Luzon in the Philippines in the South Pacific. We have evidence of Homo erectus making it to Turtle Island, which is North America. We have evidence of Homo erectus making it to Australia with the Moy Hill site. So we know that there are peoples who have been crossing water for a long, long time. When we're looking at, I would say millions is probably incorrect. I would say hundreds of thousands is more correct, because I would say probably up to 1 million years ago. So millions is absolutely incorrect. When we're looking at that ability to cross water, we are also seeing that hugging the coastline ability to cross water is coming along way earlier than a lot of times we tend to think of it. So as people are moving out of the Levant area and the Saudi or the Arabian Peninsula area, you're seeing that they're moving east. This is how we get indigenous Australians there at 70,000 years ago. This is how we get the first people coming to Turtle Island in Abayala, which is South America, the DNA states 52,000 years ago. The archaeological evidence shows 35,000 years ago. So see you later, Mama. Well, these aren't pre-human ancestors, Earthling. The genus Homo means human. So anything that has the genus Homo is a human. So when they talk about the 1.8 million year old human tooth that they found in Georgia, they're talking about Homo erectus, right? So when you're looking at anything that has the genus Homo, you're looking at somebody that is a human. So Homo erectus is human, Homo neanderthalis is human, Homo florensis is human. These are human. Uh, they are not Homo sapiens. So pre-Homo sapien has the ability to cross water, has boats of some form. Yes, absolutely. So when we're looking at those people going across that southeast part, we're seeing people go into Australia. We're seeing people go into Abayala first through a southern boat route. Yes, universal. Everywhere else within Africa, pre-colonial has Neanderthal DNA. This is from finds taken from pre-colonial digs. And it's like 1, maybe 2%. It's not a whole lot. And this is because of that time in the Levant area in the Arabian Peninsula. At this time, when you have people mixing, when you have Neanderthal and Sapien mixing in the Levant area, people are going back home into Africa, going back to their grandparents, right? Going back to their communities. And people that are Neanderthal are going up, right? And so the Sapiens who are going back into Africa are carrying the DNA because they're mating with Neanderthals. They're creating families with Neanderthals, right? So they're getting that Neanderthal genetic within them. My website, the widdaord.com website, actually has under the bibliographies. I'm not exactly sure which tab underneath the bibliographies has that. But if you go into that website, you can see scientific articles on that. When you're looking at this traveling across the eastern space, we're looking at the southeastern travel being way earlier than any of the travel that we're seeing up into the western part of Eurasia. As the travel goes into the western part of Eurasia, we're seeing that the cultures that are coming into the western part of Eurasia are leaving a lot of evidence behind. We're seeing the first evidence of cave art and Homo sapien in Western Eurasia. We're seeing this tool mixing and this understanding that comes out of the time that they're living with Neanderthals and the understandings that they're getting within this commingling of knowledge, commingling of brains, right? And in this, we see art starting to develop. We see this development of statuary, not statuary, but well, it is statuary, but more like carved statues, figurines. We now have our earliest one is a lion head man that is like 40,000 years old. We see that the goddesses, the what we call the Venuses, we see that the Venus sculptures come out of this time period. So again, when we're looking at this, a lot of people will state that our Grecian culture predates the Gravacian culture, and a lot of people will say that the our Grecian culture and the Gravacian culture are one culture. More of the newer DNA evidence shows that as we're looking at a group of people that is culturally stretching from that kind of cutoff point between East Eurasia and West Eurasia we're looking at different genetics in different places. So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is that people in the eastern part of that space have a different genetic lineage than people in the western part of that space. So down in the Iberian Peninsula, upwards into it's really hard for me to put countries on maps in Europe, so it's going to be very difficult for me to like give you exact markers. But as you're looking at coming up across the Mediterranean basin, the Mediterranean Sea, you're seeing that getting roughly like a quarter of the way over from the west down into the Iberian Peninsula is all one genetic culture, and that you see from that point over to the eastern part of this, really ending at that top of the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, you see a different genetic culture. You do see, though, that the cultures still carry many of the same similarities. They have the same statuary, they have the same tools, they have the same art. When we're looking at this, it might be easier to think of this along the lines we've talked before about how tribes and bands are two different terms for the way that communities organize. We like to, as especially in the United States, as Americans, decide that tribal and tribe means something it doesn't actually mean. The word tribe actually means a community based on genetic lineage, whereas the word band means a community that's not based on genetic lineage. So in a tribe, you might have a matriarch who had 10 daughters, and each of those 10 daughters forms her own house. In each of those houses, each daughter within that house carries on the genetic lineage. She might go to another house or another nation, and she might get her husband from there and bring her husband back. But citizenship within this community is based on how you trace your genetic lineage through your mother. Whereas in a band, citizenship within the community is not based on your genetics, but based on the need of having you within the community. Having more people within your community at a time when communities are small means that people can hunt easier, means that people have more tools, means that people are safer. And so you're going to have more members of your community, and you're not really going to care about their genetic lineage within a band. So when we're looking at gradations and we're looking at two different spaces of genetic lineages, we can look at this almost as a space where you find maybe a couple of different nations based on genetic lineage. So, or a couple of different tribes based on genetic lineage within one nation. So you might see, because the Gravatian culture all shares the same culture, that the culture itself, that the nation is Gravatian, but these are two different tribes within the nation because they are based on genetic lineage. It is absolutely United States citizens, not Americans. So when we are looking at that, it's important to understand that you can share culture without sharing genetics. With this sharing of culture without sharing genetics, what you're looking at is still a same culture, still a same ethnicity, right? You're looking at a people who shares history, who shares ancestry, and who shares knowledge. Now, again, if you're just coming in, we're looking at the Gravatians. The Gravatians spread across the lower part of Western Eurasia at the end of the last ice age. They're not, some call them the first, and some would say that they're the second group of people that are coming across. When we're looking at this, again, some people would state that the Argratians, and I'm just going to butcher this every time I try and say it, are the first culture coming in, and that the Gravatians supplant them. Some people would state that the Argratians and the Gravatians are the same culture. So you see that the end of the Gravatian culture happens in different places at different times. You're going to see that the final ending of what we consider the culture of the Gravatians is roughly at 18,000 years ago. And you're going to see that it's replaced with the Solutrean culture in the Iberian Peninsula, and the Alatrian, oh God, hold on a second. Let me remember the name of who supplants the Gravatians outside of that. Epigravatian. And so the Epigravatian are the people that are the Epigravatian are called Epigravatian because they're using some of the same Gravatian tools, and they're considered to be Gravatian, just the later development of their Gravatian people, right? Giovanni, I haven't gotten any of that. I don't tend to focus on that very much. When I see things about Turtle Island and Abiyala, I tend to share them for Turtle Islanders and Abiyalians, but I don't actually tend to teach Turtle Island or Abiyalian histories. I love to uplift the many other people on here who I know who are teaching those things. I just don't I'm not a culture keeper, and so that's not my space and my place. Uh, and While I know that there are many people who love to see the archaeological evidence, and white academics actually finally acknowledging stuff that we have known for a long time here in Turtle Island and in Abiyala, I also know that there are many people who couldn't care less, right? And so I really don't want to be teaching that, just because, again, I just don't find it to be my space, my lane. And because, again, I was asked by many Turtle Islanders to come in and speak about the ancestral connections for Europeans. And this came about 2 years ago. There was a big conference of water protectors uh, down in Louisiana. I keep wanting to say the bayou, but it's not the bayou. Down in that like a delta down there. There's a huge conference of water protectors, and many of the accomplices stood up in this conference and said, "Listen, I really want to find my ancestry without cultural appropriation. How can I find my own ancestry without appropriating Indigenous culture?" And as a result, several of my siblings who were there contacted me and said, "Hey, we need you to help with this because we know that you know." So that's kind of what this is me coming into TikTok and doing that. So when we're looking at the timelines within Mesoamerica, within Abiyala and within Turtle Island, I always want to double down so everybody knows that those timelines are way earlier than anybody has thought for the longest time. There are people in Turtle Island before there are people in the island of Britain. There are people in Turtle Island before there are people in Scandinavia. Homo sapien makes it to Turtle Island before Homo sapien makes it to Northwest Europe. And the cultures and the traditions here within Turtle Island and Abiyala are extremely old. The growth of food products, the husbandry of food, the ability to tend the planet is extremely old. Medicine and science here didn't get cut off until way later than other areas. Europe cuts off their medicine and science around 400, and because they don't invade until another 1,000 years, it maintains for another 1,000 years here. And there are places here in Turtle Island that didn't get colonized until the 1900s, and there are places in Abiyala that still are not colonized. And so within these spaces, there are definitely that continuation of this ancient science and medicine that's been here. Physical archaeology shows at least 35,000 years. DNA shows 52,000 years. So people have been in these spaces forever. As long as they have been anywhere else except for Australia, people have been in Abiyala and Turtle Island. Or Africa. I mean, we all come from Africa originally. That is the original continent of all sapiens and all Homo erectus. So, but when we're when we're looking at this, I definitely want to make sure that I double down on that knowledge for people because people need to know those things. People absolutely need to know that Turtle Island and Abiyala is older than Europe. Absolutely 100%. Stop taking from us on the basis that you think you're better because you think you've been around longer because you ain't. And, we absolutely need to double down on those things. I just don't teach a lot of those things just because I'm not a culture keeper. It's not mainly because as not a culture keeper, I don't get to judge what's okay to teach to everybody and what's not okay to teach to everybody, right? I don't get to judge what's okay to say to everybody because I don't keep culture. That's not my space. So when we're looking at the gravations and we're looking at the Western European culture, again, we're looking at a culture. Hopefully soon. That's not true, Diva. There's no archaeological finds on anywhere that show that Africa is not the oldest. Africa is not only the oldest civilization that we have on this planet, through physical archaeology, such as being able to find stone tools millions of years old in Africa, being able to find cities. The oldest civilization, as in like physical space of continued occupation, is like 70,000 years ago. It's in Africa. The population that carries all the genetics for Homo sapien, like all the Homo sapien genetics on this planet, is the Kwe population of South Africa. They carry all the genetics, which shows that they are the original population when you look at DNA, right? We do see that, Australia's indigenous population has been there for 70,000 years. So they are the second oldest population outside of the continent of Africa, absolutely. But we absolutely know that Africa is where Homo sapiens starts. We now know that Homo sapiens starts all over Africa. Like we see our oldest is in Morocco, and then we see people a little bit later in South Africa. And so we now know that the population of Homo sapien also starts from convergence of many different Homo species, right? So, hi, gorgeous. When we see, mm, so no. By the time Columbus lands on the Taino people, the people here in Abya were no longer what we would call phenotypically Black. They were phenotypically Turtle Island Indigenous or Abyalian Indigenous, meaning they had copper-toned skin and extremely straight, coarse hair. Everybody, as they leave Africa, looks like this. This is a European. Getting to Northern European white doesn't happen until like 2,000 years ago. We start to see lighter coming along like 5,000 years ago, right? In Europe, we haven't really assessed when people in Abya and Turtle Island go from being what we might call phenotypically Black to phenotypically Turtle Island Indigenous or Abyalian Indigenous. We know that that is well before Christopher Columbus arrives. So we absolutely must understand that those who are phenotypically Black in America today, in the United States, in Canada, in South America, in Mesoamerica, that are phenotypically Black today, unless they also have indigenous ancestry, are phenotypically Black because they have ancestry from Africa after 1492, that their ancestors come here after 1492. Now, that does not mean that they don't have indigeneity, because they have indigeneity in Africa. It does not mean that there are not Afro-Indigenous people who have African heritage and Turtle Island or Abyalian Indigenous heritage, right? What it does mean is that those today who, the descendants of slavery within the United States and Canada and Mexico and South America come from Africa. There were indigenous people here that did not look phenotypically Black within Abya or Turtle Island. They maybe looked somewhat, and actually I would say they probably didn't even look phenotypically Black when they arrived. And the reason that I would state that is because they have 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovan DNA. And Denisovan DNA adds new phenotypes. Denisovan DNA gives new look, right? So I would say they probably were still, probably had tightly coiled hair and were probably dark and probably not quite copper in tone when they arrived. But by the time Europeans get here in 1492, by the time Europeans get here in 1000, when the Vikings arrive in Vinland, they are definitely what we would call phenotypically Turtle Island Indigenous, which also should be understood that typical phenotype Turtle Island Indigenous is a range of skin tone. They just all have that copper undertone to them. So if you're from the Arctic, you might be lighter of skin tone. And if you live on the equator, you might be darker of skin tone, but you're going to have that copper undertone to you, right? So we absolutely, Izzy, and I'm trying to absolutely, I mean, I see that it's an honest question and I'm answering it with love and honesty, right? I'm not, how dare you ethnocentric on me, right? Like, I'm definitely answering with love and honesty. It just needs to be understood that when people get to Abya, when Europeans invade Abya, because they do invade Abya first, when Europeans arrive in Abya, phenotypically people in Abya, the people that they meet are all described as being of copper skin tone and all described as having very straight, coarse hair. Right. We do have what we call ghost species. Ghost species are species where we see like a little fingerprint of them in our DNA, but we haven't found the whole species, the whole genome. Just like we see kind of a fingerprint of Neanderthal and a fingerprint of Denisovan, but we don't see but we do see the whole genome of both of those because we have them in the fossil record. So ghost species has that same kind of phenotype, fingerprint, my words. As I said, I'm still coming off of sick, so I'm a little bit blah. So I apologize for that up front. That the ghost species that we see, we have a total of 5 that we see within us. 3 are within those 2 populations in Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA within them, the Yoruba population and the Kwe population. The other 2 we see, one within Turtle Island and Abayalian indigenous people and one within indigenous Australians. Both of these species correlate with finds that we have in both spaces. There's a find in Turtle Island that's 130,000 years old called the Ceruti mastodon find that is a descendant species of Homo erectus that speciates here. And there's a find in Australia called the Moyhill site that is a descendant species of Homo erectus that speciates there. Like we envelop every other species that we come across and live within us, we envelop those species when we get to those spaces. So DNA wise, Turtle Island indigenous people and Abayalian indigenous people absolutely have a unique, a ghost species, unique DNA within them. We also see the same thing for indigenous Australians, right? So when we're looking at the gradations, Africa had civilizations going back hundreds of thousands of years. When we're looking at the gradations, we're looking at a culture that is most known for its Venus figurines. They also had different tools and hunting strategies that you're going to see within a lot of other cultures at the time. They kept dogs. The Gradations are some of our earliest examples of dogs. And I want to again tell you what timelines we're looking at with the Gradations. We're looking at the Gradations at over 33,000, 35,000 years ago, up until 17,000 years ago, and they kept working dogs. So our idea of dogs being 10,000 years old is incorrect. Dogs go back way further than that. Are you asking me Potolo? Because I didn't say that. So prior to colonization, everywhere on the planet except for 2 spaces in Africa has Neanderthal DNA. The 2 communities within Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA prior to colonization are the Yoruba population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa, and they have ghost species within them, 3 ghost species within them, like there's a ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous and Abayalian indigenous people, and a ghost species in Australian indigenous people. The rest of Africa, except for those 2 communities, does have Neanderthal DNA within them. The scientific source is an article that I have put underneath the bibliographies on the website that is down right there in widdaord.com. This is my website that I use to compile articles so that you can see them, so that you can have the sources that you're asking for. I really don't know, Lee. I would state that absolutely with, intermixing and with admixture, you're going to see that, maybe somebody in Sweden has a ghost species from the Yoruba population because they have an ancestor who's Yoruba, right? Yes, absolutely. It's a peer-reviewed article. It's a, let me see if I can pull it up here really quick. It comes from a scientific journal, though, and it is a peer-reviewed article. I'm trying to... Let me see. Well, that one doesn't have anything else underneath it. It is an article that I put up there a while ago, so I'm not exactly sure which tab it is under. But it is under the bibliography tabs. I would say it's probably under the Homo Neanderthal. Ah, ha, 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 ha. There. The author is B. Jordan. It's published in Medicine Sciences. It is under the Neanderthal tabs, and it is the second link in the actual written out links, not the embedded ones. It is the second one. It says Neanderthal DNA in Africans. It has the link takes you to an abstract, which will get you to full text links that you can get into. One is there, and then one is published in a scientific medicine journal as well. So absolutely, peer-reviewed articles. White Stone Age Europeans were first in North America. Diva, you are fucking so wrong. You're just not even. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, when do you think that the light color skin tone comes about within Homo sapien? I mean, when do you think the first white comes about? Absolutely. Potolo. Sorry. Diva, when do you think the first white in Homo sapien comes about? When do you think that people were white when they got to Britain? And when do you think people got to Britain? Boy, you were really talkative until I asked you a question. Okay, that doesn't answer the question I asked you, Diva. And I'm telling you right now, the Smithsonian doesn't say that those are white people. Not a single bit of it. Not a single bit of the Smithsonian says that those are white people. But when do you think? First of all, let's go with this. When is the first people in Britain? And what is their skin tone? In Britain. It's not speculation when it's based on science. When science gives you something as a fact, it's no longer a speculation. It is a black man in my background. He is European, though. Diva, you're incorrect. First of all, the first people in Abiyala, which is South America, and in Turtle Island, which is North America, come through Southeast Asia. They never spent any time in Europe. Like, never spent a single day in Europe. Not a single day in Europe. Not a single day in Europe. And no one anywhere ever, except for in like the 1850s when they're first developing the theory of race and they're first developing the theory of evolution, nowhere ever anywhere has anybody ever said that Turtle Island indigenous people came from Europe. People say that they come from Asia, but they never say they come from Europe. Okay. So that's the first thing. I'm not moving the goalpost. I'm asking you to answer a question so I can show you where you're wrong. The first people in Europe at 14,000 years ago were black. The first people there, Scandinavia at 7,000 years ago was settled by two groups of people. One who was dark skinned and blue eyed, coming from Southwest Europe, and one who was light skinned and dark eyed, coming from the Eurasian steppes, coming from the steppes. Okay. So there is never a point of time that Turtle Island is settled by white Europeans. There's never, until they start attacking and invading, white Europeans aren't here. Oh, except for, of course, the Vikings who do make it here, and leave because they don't want to fuck with the Skraelings, as they call them, right? So that's just not true on any level. Clovis Man is 12,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, and he's not white. He's not European. And he's not the first. People are here. Archaeological physical evidence by 35,000 years ago. DNA evidence shows 52,000 years ago. Turtle Island is one of the names, indigenous names for North America, obviously translated into English. Black with blue eyes are not mixed. See, you think that at the time that there were different colors on the planet, but there weren't different colors on the planet. So first of all, let me clarify that when we're talking about darker shades and lighter shades, we're talking about shades. We're talking about a range. We're not talking about everybody's the same color, right? And that's something that really needs to be understood that isn't often understood. We are not talking about everybody looking the exact same. We're talking about ranges of color. And again, we need to understand that race does not exist. It is a colonial construct. It has no root in biology, and it is false. Culture exists and ethnicity exists, but race does not. When we're looking at people moving across Eurasia, we're not looking at people who are mixed because there's nothing to mix with except for other species. So at this point of time, the people that they're coming in contact with are other species of humans like Neanderthal or Denisovan or the ghost species that we see. They're not going into spaces where white people who are Homo sapien already exist and they're mixing. The reason that the first people in Eurasia are dark of skin and light of eye is because light eyes is a low light adaptation, and we need that before we need light skin. I can get my vitamin D from other things. I can't, however, adjust to be able to see in the low light the beings that are attacking me. So I have to get a low light eye adaptation, visual adaptation, visualization adaptation before I get the skin adaptation. And this is all an adaptation. This is adapting to a space, and it is further adapting to a region along the equator. It is adapting to the latitude where the sun is at and what that means for the brightness of the area, right? So, no. At the point of time when you see that people who look like this are moving across Europe, the people that are looking like this moving across Europe stay looking like this for a couple 10,000 years at least. So this is a Gravatian person, and the Gravatian culture goes from 35,000 years ago to 17,000 years ago. And within the Gravatian culture, this is what we see through DNA. Okay. Through the DNA, we see a culture who is dark of skin because they haven't adapted to a low light environment yet. Homo sapiens starts like Erectus starts in Africa. And because we start in Africa, we start adapted to a high light environment because speciation is adapting. How we become new species, how we evolve, evolution is adapting. And because it's about adapting, you adapt to the region that you are born in, as in your species is created in, as in born in. So because you are created in a region, you are created specifically for that region. When you're created specifically for a region, you're created with a body that works best in that region, right? And when you're created with a body that works best within that region, and you are a mammal who is in a high sun area, you're created with dark skin. Okay. And so as you're moving out into very low light areas, you start to get lighter skin. It takes 100 generations for an adaptation to happen. And that 100 generations is currently 2,500 years, because currently a generation is 25 years. Now, 40,000 years ago, maybe a generation was 20 years. And so maybe it was 2,000 years, 40,000 years ago. But an adaptation doesn't go from one end of the extreme to the other end of the extreme in 100 generations. It goes from one end to a quarter of the way there in 100 generations, and then maybe another quarter of the way there in another 100 generations, and then maybe another quarter of a way there in another 100 generations. So you don't get from being extremely dark in an extremely high sun content area to extremely light in an extremely low sun content area in a generation. You don't do it in 100 generations. You do it in several hundred generations, right? So we know for a fact through DNA that even Otzi is dark, and Otzi's 5,000 years ago. We know that roughly 5,000 years ago, we start to see a higher presence of light skin within European populations. We know that at 2,000 years ago, we might be looking at 70% of the population is light of skin. And again, I remind you that these are scales. This is not everybody Northwest European Viking white, okay? This is lighter scales. We know, and I can point to you at places in the sagas, Egil is dark of skin. Sorry, I'm coming off of COVID, and so my body doesn't work very well right now. Now I'm going to apologize beforehand because of the fact that to anyone who is Sami or Finn within here, I apologize. There was a man named Ulf, the son of Bjalfi and Halbera, the daughter of Ulf the Fearless. She was the sister of Halfbjorn Halftroll from Hrafnista, the father of Ketil Hing. Halftroll or troll is the slur used for the Sami or the Finn people by the Vikings. It is a slur. It is not okay, and that's why I apologize beforehand. Ulf was said to be a very clever farmer. Oh, where is it that it shows? Some people called him Kveldolf or White Night Wolf and called him a shapeshifter. Kveldolf and his wife had two sons. The older one was named Thorolf and the younger one Grim, and they both grew up to be big, strong men like their father. Thorolf was an attractive, highly accomplished man. He took after his mother's side of the family. A cheerful, generous man, energetic and very eager to prove his worth. He was popular with everyone. Grim was swarthy and ugly, resembling his father in both appearance and character. So Grim is the father of Egil, Skullgrim's son, right? Egil is said to have looked like his father. King Harold inherited the titles of his father, Halfdan the Black. These people within here who are called swarthy or black are it's not Rudy. There's another one within here that also indicates dark of skin. These people are all dark of skin. There are many people in the sagas who are dark of skin. So even when we get to the sagas at 1,000 Common Era, we are looking at having at least 10% of the population dark of skin, right? So we have to understand that skin tone is an adaptation for environment. And because skin tone is an adaptation for environment, adaptations take time. So adapting from the high sun, dark skin, high melanin content, because we all have melanin, it's just the amount of melanin that you have that dictates the tone of your skin. The high melanin content in the skin needed for a high sun environment to the light melanin that some people have in their skin due to a low sun environment takes thousands of years to get there. Okay. So when we're looking at this, we need to understand that melanation is within everybody. It's just the amount of melanin that you have in the concentration of melanin that you have in your skin. B, that light skin is an adaptation for certain regions of the globe. It is the fact that we can adapt that is amazing, not the fact that we can get light that is amazing. Lightness is actually not something that's helpful. It's only helpful in very specific regions where you can be dark and be in any region. But if you're really light and you go into specific regions, you're going to die because you're light in those regions, right? So being light is not an advantage. It's not an evolutionary step forward. It is an adaptation that human beings go through because of the environment that they're in, because we all species adapt. That's how you become a species. You become a species by adapting. You didn't start like this. You started like Lucy. You started like Lucy. Okay. You didn't start looking like this. And it's through many, many, many adaptations to environment that you get from Lucy Australopithecus to Homo sapien, right? It's an adaptation. And starting as Homo sapien in a high sun environment, we all start with tightly coiled hair, which is a protection against high sun. And we all start with dark eyes, which is a protection against high sun. And we all start with dark skin, which is a protection against high sun. And when we move into other areas and we adapt to those other areas, taking thousands and thousands of years to adapt to those other areas, the adaptations are what you're looking at. And it's the ability to adapt that is the miracle. It is the ability to adapt that is the advantage. It is not what you adapt into that is the advantage. Professor Nina Jablonski, absolutely. I think I know that name. Your name is main character and you're spouting the word propaganda. Do you know what the word propaganda means? Because it doesn't sound like you do. I'll do you one better. We're going to put a link to Nina's stuff. Under the Homo sapien page. I hadn't thought of that. She is actually really great. I've seen her before. I'm not pushing a narrative. I'm giving understanding and knowledge. Absolutely, Sharon. I'm not pushing a narrative. I would state, yeah, propaganda is a history book you're being taught in school. I would state that I am trying to give ideas. Absolutely. I was very lucky. I didn't grow up. Well, I grew up in the borders of the United States. I didn't grow up in America. I didn't grow up in this culture. I spent first 5 years in indigenous communities, and then I moved in the middle of the woods and learned from archaeological texts. That's how I learned my reading. I went to a regular school, maybe a couple months a year, spent most of my time snowed in. And so by the time I hit mainstream society at 12, I had been reading archaeology and anthropology most of my life. And so I looked at it through an archaeologist and anthropological standpoint, even at 12. Um, and so, because of that, and because of the fact that I grew up like that and that I'm neurodivergent, I didn't really become a part of any culture. I always stood outside most. And because of that, I can actually look, right? I can actually see. Epicanthic folds are for sun reflection off of the snow. In regions that have heavy snow, but not a lot of cloud cover, you're going to see that sun reflects off of the snow. And when sun reflects off the snow, it bounces back up into the face. And when it bounces back up into the face, the epicanthic folds protect. It protects the eyes from the bounce of the sun back up, basically. Human skin color is not dominant or recessive. And you can be two white people and have a black child, or two black people and have a white child. Phenotype is not indicative of genotype. Science has proven that phenotype is not indicative of genotype. Science has proven that race doesn't exist, that culture and ethnicity exists, but race does not exist. So I did not once, main character, say that I'm more intelligent than you. I question everything. And because I question everything, I have a little bit of knowledge. And I know that it's not knowledge that most people have. I also have degrees, right? Like I have archaeology degrees and I have medical degrees. And because of that, I have some knowledge that some people don't have. Now, do I think that nobody has that knowledge? No. I'm getting it from other people anyways. So obviously other people have that knowledge. I'm trying to share that knowledge so that the average person who can't afford a $40,000 a year paywall, or can't understand language that it's hard for people with multiple degrees sometimes to understand, can have access to information. I don't think I'm more intelligent than you. In fact, I would state that I'm probably not more intelligent than most people. Lots of people call me intelligent, but I don't think I'm intelligent. I just think I'm a questioning human. And because I'm questioning, and because I have a different lived experience than most people, I can look at it through a different lens. And sometimes when you look at something through a different lens, you see it slightly differently. And that's why I was saying that my lived experience is different. Because my lived experience is different, I can see things in a different way than you might be able to see them through the lens that you have. And you're going to see them differently than I'm going to see them, which is why I listen to others and learn from others, because I know that I can't see through your lens, and your lens is going to give me a different viewpoint. And when I compile many different viewpoints and make my own decisions on those different viewpoints, I have the ability to understand things just like you do, just like anybody else does. Sand and snow act in the same way. I don't know if you've ever been into a desert. It's not that fun, let me tell you, having been through a couple. But sand does the same thing that snow does. So when sun hits sand, it will reflect back up, right? Same thing with like shale. Shale can be like really light or really white. And so if you have a space that's really heavy with like shale or certain types of geological rocks, like structures, it will reflect, right? And so you'll see that the empathic fold can be seen in places where there's no snow, but there's a lot of sand, or a lot of shale or really light rock, that covers those spaces. And it's for the same reason, because the sun hits that and reflects back up. And that's why you will see it with Bantu people. Although my understanding is that word is not necessarily the best word to use. Kwe is a better word for what is called the Khoisan people. Khoisan is not the correct term. It's a colonial term. So Kwe, if you can't make the click, Kwe is the better way to use it. And my understanding is that My understanding is that Bantu is not an appropriate word, that there's a better word for it. I can't think of it off the top of my head, though. So, okay. And that makes sense. Um, I do know that I've had people who are of that community state that they would rather that word not be used, that for them it is a slur. And again, I mean, I'm Turtle Island Indigenous, among obviously other things, including African. Um, uh, because I know that like within the Indigenous community, there are people who will use the word Indian, and that's how they still refer to themselves. So most of us would prefer that other people don't use that term for us. There are people who use the word Native American, and that's how they refer to themselves because that's what they've been taught. But there are some people who would prefer not to use that term. So it really depends. There's a broad usage within community. For me, if you are a member of a community, I don't care how you call yourself. I'm going to do my best not to call you words that might be slurs to some people within your community, just because for me, that's the appropriate way to be. And that makes sense, right? I just, like I said, I've had people tell me that that was not a preferred term. So, and I can't off the top of my head remember what the preferred was. And so I'm trying to remember. Like I said, my brain no fuzzy. So when we're looking at people moving across Western Europe, back to the Gravatians once again, when we're looking at people moving across Western Europe, and we're looking at people who are taking their culture across Western Europe, we're looking at groups of people who are absolutely darkest skin at the time that they're moving across. We're looking at groups of people, and again, this is darker shade. It is not everybody is extremely dark or extremely light on anything. We're looking at two genetically distinct groups of people. Starting the DNA evidence on these goes back to 45,000 years. And so this DNA evidence is going to include the Argratian culture, right? Because the Argratian culture, again, we see that certain peoples believe that the Argratian culture predates the Gravatian culture, and certain peoples believe that the Gravatian and the Argratian are the same culture, right? So the Argratian culture that is said to predate their Gravatian culture goes back to 45,000 years. This is the first culture that we see moving across Western Eurasia. And again, by this point of time, people have already moved across Southeast Eurasia. People have been, by 45,000 years, people have been in Australia by, oh God, for 25,000 years at least. The Indigenous Australians have been there. And people have been moving along the islands of the South Pacific into Turtle Island. Again, DNA evidence puts that DNA split at 52,000 years ago into Abiyala. And the oldest finds that we have here in Turtle Island show 35,000 years ago. So by 45,000 years ago, if you go by the DNA, people are already here in Turtle Island by about 7,000 years. And if you go by the archaeology, they're already moving across southwest or southeast Eurasia into the islands of the South Pacific and headed to South America. Current understanding is that there are 3 waves to Abiyala and Turtle Island. Again, Abiyala is South America and Turtle Island is North America. And when we look at those 3 waves, that the first wave goes through a boat route through the South Pacific, through that ring of fire down in the South Pacific that's constantly popping up islands. They found a new continent that they had decided had disappeared. It's like they thought it was gone for like 374 years. And now they're like, oh, wait, here it is. It's just massively underwater except for a little piece of it. So there's constantly islands and land masses in the South Pacific. And so that movement across has already started by 45,000 years ago. So as we're moving into Western Eurasia with the Argratian peoples, and we're moving across and taking this culture that becomes the Gravatian culture, or could possibly still be the Eurasian culture. Again, this is archaeology looking at things and deciding that, this tool is being used. So this is a new culture. this method is being used, so this is a new culture. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not genetically linked. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not the same culture and haven't been the same culture the entire time and the same family tree the entire time. It just means that they're advancing in their tool usage into what we distinguish through archaeological record as being a new culture. We see that the Gravations use shells as ornaments. They sew their clothing. They actually are some of the earlier peoples who actually have tailored clothing. Tailored means, so we see that clothing goes back into Homo erectus, that Homo erectus has clothing. We see clothing within Neanderthal. We see clothing throughout many different species of humans. When we look, Hawaii is a South Pacific island as well. When we look um, across the wearing of clothes, we see that early on, you might like take a hide and tan a hide and toss it over your body, like make a poncho out of it and tie it around your waist, right? That's not tailored clothing. Tailored clothing is taking on either an awl or a bone needle. Now we do see that we have evidence of tailored clothing within the Neanderthals, right? We do see it 40,000 years ago that the Neanderthals are still there. So when we're looking at the sewing clothing with bone needles, we're going to see that bone needles are probably coming after awls. So when awl is going to be used, you line up your fabric, in this case, most likely furs or leather. We're not exactly sure when the first weaving is starting yet. We do have our oldest evidences of weaving, yet that doesn't necessarily mean it's the start of weaving, because that's not something that lasts so much in the archaeological record. So when they're looking at sewing their clothing prior to usage of needles, what you're looking at is taking an awl and poking a hole. And then you're going to poke the hole in several different spaces, and then you're going to use that awl probably to shove some sinew or to shove some cordage through to sew your clothing. Then you get to the point of using bone needles first. We use bone for things like awls and needles, small fine work, tattoo tools, which are 35,000 years, as our oldest tattoo tool in a cave in France, though that one is a stone flake. A lot of tattooing tools are actually bone tools as well, because these are very fine. You can make them much finer than you can make most bone. So you're seeing that bone needles are being used within the Gravation culture to tailor the clothing. Now, that doesn't mean you're high couture. It just means that it fits the body, that maybe you're making pants and a top that actually fits the body, so it's not letting through drafts of air. It's not cold underneath, right? So when we see that, this is a pretty big advancement within the usage of bone needles is a pretty big advancement. We do see that they keep working dogs. And again, we're looking at a culture that the Gravation period itself is 35,000 years ago to 17,000 years ago. So this is 35,000 years ago. They're keeping working dogs who they feed a specific diet. They're feeding reindeer meat with there's at least within the Czech Republic, within the what we would call, I believe, the steppes, or God, again, I am jack shit with geography. It is not something I'm good at, but within areas that you're going to find reindeers, the Gravations are feeding their dogs reindeer meat. We're also seeing that they have narrow stone points. So their stone tools, their spears are very narrow pointed spears. And we also see that we see bows and spear throwers within them as well. So we're starting to see the atlatl being used, and we're starting to see bows being used. Of course, the atlatl is being used within Abya at this time period too, right? The atlatl is one of those things that is a unique Homo sapien tool, and it is one that Homo sapiens across the globe are using. When we're looking at the Gravations, again, we're looking at two genetically distinct cultures, and yet their culture, not two genetically distinct groups, communities, and yet their culture spreads across those two genetically distinct communities. So again, when we're looking at verbiage for communities, the word tribe does not mean what most people take it to mean. The word tribe means a community based on genetic lineage, and the word band means a community based on non-genetic lineage, so just on need of community, right? So we're probably looking at maybe two tribes within a nation. You have two genetically distinct groups, and your citizenship is based on your genetics, and yet your overarching nation shares the same culture. We didn't default to hate, though. So we are about 300,000 years from the start of our species to us today. We solidified as a species between 135,000 years ago to 125,000 years ago. The first evidence of definitive violence is seen at 10,000 years ago. So even if you go from the solidification of us as a species at 125,000 years ago, that's still 115,000 years without violence before we hit the point of violence. Violence comes with stratification. Violence comes with ownership. Once you can own land and dehumanize the globe, dehumanize the biome, dehumanize the earth, once you can dehumanize the earth, you can dehumanize other people. You dehumanize the earth, you dehumanize the plants, you dehumanize the animals. Next step is dehumanizing other people. So we see that violence starts with stratification and ownership of property, as in land, and therefore dehumanizing the earth. So we're not a violent species. We are, in fact, biologically nurturing and communal. We must have community biologically, and we must nurture community biologically. I've talked about this one a couple of times, but it's always a good one to go over. The reason that I state that biologically we are nurturing and communal is because biologically we must have somebody assist us to give birth. We are the only species on the planet currently, and the only other species that ever did have mandatory midwifery was Neanderthals. Mandatory midwifery comes from the shape of the child's head versus the shape of the child's shoulders versus the shape of the pelvic outlet and the position of the pelvic outlet. When we look at a neonate or an infant being born, a newborn's head, their head is oval and their shoulders are oval, but their head and their shoulders are both oval the same way. Their head is oval like this, and their shoulders are oval like this. And when we look at the pelvic outlet of a human being, of a Homo sapien, we're looking at a pelvic outlet that's also oval. And so to pull the baby through that pelvic outlet, you need assistance. So the baby is facing backwards with their nose facing backwards. Now, all other primates, the baby starts with their nose facing forward, and the baby is small compared to the pelvic outlet. So the mother doesn't need assistance. She can reach down between her legs and pull that baby directly up onto her chest. But with Homo sapiens, the baby starts with the nose facing backwards. And because of the shape of the head versus the shape of the shoulders, you have to do a half turn to get through the pelvic outlet. And then the baby's nose is facing that way. Now you got to get to the shoulders. So you have to do it, not a half turn, I'm sorry, a quarter turn. And then you have to do another quarter turn. Thank you. With the nose, and the nose will face up and the shoulders can come through. And then you can pull the baby. Now this requires help. Now, there are exceptions to every rule. We all know some of the exceptions to the rule, and I'm not going to argue that there aren't exceptions. There are. This is really, though, mandatory within us, and we consider mandatory midwifery to be something that is basal, which is unique, which is only seen within humans, right? Totally understand Marshmallow. I'm there all the time. The other thing that we see within humans that we have not seen within any other species, even other human species like Neanderthals, is that we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. 5 life stages from our birth to the point that our brain fully forms and is closed. This currently is at 25 years for us. Because we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult, we have the longest childhood and adolescence of any animal on this planet. Currently, we have 25 years between neonate and adulthood, which means that we have 25 years that we're supposed to be nurturing and caring for another individual to get them to a state of adulthood. And we have to teach our children everything. We have to teach our children to walk. We have to teach our children to talk. It might be me. Yeah, I might be, though it isn't popping up that way right now. Um, because we have to teach our children to walk, and we have to teach our children to talk, and we have to teach our children to use all the tools. This gives us advantages. This gives us a more malleable brain, which means that our neurons end up firing faster and we can understand things in a newer way. Because our brain doesn't close as quick as some other species, we have a broader understanding of the world. It also means that we have to take care of children for a longer time. The longest time frame from neonate to adult, other than Homo sapiens currently, is elephants, and it's 5 years. Ours is 25 years. Ours is 5 times the amount. And you need a community to do that. Even today, you need a community. Even today, if I was a single mother and it was just me raising my child, I would still need somebody to work for. I would still need somebody to take care of my children while I'm at work, right? I still need other people to go out and procure the food to put it in the store for me to go to the store to buy it, right? I still need other people even today. But if we look at 100,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, I need an entire community to ensure that I have all the needs, the nutrients for myself, the nutrients for this child, through the nursing phases, through the stay with the child 24/7 phases. And then I also need to make sure that the child learns things that I might not be able to teach them, right? I'm probably a hunter because women were hunting as much as, if not more than men. But because I'm a hunter, I can't teach basket weaving, and I need somebody else to teach my child basket weaving, right? So we have to have community and we have to have nurture. So we are biologically nurturing and communal. We are biologically driven to help each other, not harm each other. And because we're biologically driven to help each other and not harm each other, the idea that we're out there harming each other is a great way to keep you in check, right? A great way to make sure that you don't realize that you're being harmed, right? It's kind of that othering come into play. Hey, Omi. Um, I've been going for like an hour and a half, and normally I would go longer, but like I said earlier, I am just coming off of COVID, and I'm starting to feel my body saying, "Fuck off, sit down." Yeah. So I am going to go ahead and go and get off of here. I probably will come back before the end of the week, but I cannot guarantee. I am kind of struggling a little bit. And so it might be a minute or two, but I will try and come back before the end of the week. I want to remind everybody before I go that we are all nurturing and communal. And because we are all nurturing and communal, but we live in a society that tells us that those things are bad, we're all kind of depressed. We live in a society that's really harmful to us. And because we are currently indoctrinated into and live in a society that's really harmful to us, when you're depressed, when you're anxious, when you feel like there's something wrong, when people scare the holy fuck out of you, please remember that there's nothing wrong with you. That's in fact a right with you. That is a healthy and natural response to a world that is trying to harm you and others. That's compassionate, that's empathetic. It is a positive response. So if you are depressed, if you are anxious, you are somebody who is having a healthy response to the world around you. And therefore, you are somebody who is needed to help facilitate change to a healthier and better world. You are not the problem, you are the solution. You are what will help us get there. So if you are living with, if you are spending your time concerned, if you are spending your time depressed, if you don't want to leave your house because it's fucking scary, please remember that you're not the problem, you're the solution, and you are necessary to us, to the society as a whole. Society is currently sick. And until we can identify the illness and all start working towards healing, it's going to stay sick. So if you're identifying the illness by your depression and your anxiety over this sick society, that is a positive and it is necessary. So please hang on and hang in there because you are necessary. You are not the problem. You are the solution. And you are loved. And we are all worthy and valuable just by sitting here. We do not need to be exploitable by other people. We do not need to provide value on some societal level to be valuable. We are all worthy and valuable. Please remember that you are worthy, and valuable. So much love to all of you, and you are all loved. Even just by me, you are all loved. Make sure that you take care of yourself and make sure that you give yourself grace. It is necessary. Much love to everybody, and I will be back just as soon as I can. Bye, everybody. Much love, YouTube, and I will be back just as soon as I can. Take care of yourself.